Warning in Daniel 12, chapter 4, part 9. What are the voices which begin and end the 1260 days? If the prophetic exposition is correct, the same hermeneutic principles and the same procedures should be applied not only to the 1335-day timeline, but also to the 1260-day timeline of Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. The 1330-day timeline of Daniel 12, verse 12 began and ended with voices. It begins with the voice of a nation, the United States of America, and ends with the voice of God. It begins with the speaking of a nation in legislative action, a national Sunday law in the United States of America, and ends with the speaking of God as he pronounces the blessing of the everlasting covenant. It begins with the fulfillment of prophecy, Revelation chapter 13, verse 11, and ends with the fulfillment of prophecy, Revelation chapter 16, verse 17. In like manner, the 1260-day timeline begins and ends with voices. It begins with the voices of all nations united with the voice of the beast power of Revelation chapter 13, verse 5, and ends with the voices of all nations united with the image to the beast, Revelation chapter 13, verse 15. These voices are the speaking of the nations, which are legislative degrees. The 1260-day timeline begins and ends with the fulfillment of prophetic scripture. Both in hermeneutic principle and in application, the 1335-day timeline and the 1260-day timeline are identical. The 1260-day timeline begins with the fulfillment of Revelation chapter 13, verse 5. It ends with the fulfillment of Revelation 13:15. Both of these verses are the speaking or voices of prophetic fulfillment. The 1260 timelines of Daniel 12:7, we look at the beginning, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking, and power was given him to continue 42 months, Revelation 13, verse 5. The end, the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed, Revelation 13, verse 15, which makes up the beginning and the end of the 1260 days. It's a similar application as 1335 days with a beginning and an end. Part 10. What event begins the 1260-day timeline? Revelation 13, verse 5, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. Great Controversy, page 442. The speaking of a nation or nations is the action of its legislative and judicial authorities. The speaking or legislative action, which takes place in Revelation 13, verse 5, is done not by the United States, but by the beast himself. Papal Rome will legislate, and the nations of the world will take judicial action. This represents a union of church and state on a worldwide basis. The prophecy continues, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. Power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. Power was given unto him to continue 42 months. These are the 1260 days of Revelation chapter 13, verses 8 and verse 7. What kind of a legislation of what kind of law would cause all nations to worship him? What is the mark of his authority? By what legislation could Papal Rome claim the worship of all nations? This is taken from the Great Controversy, page 448. It was written by Henry Turberville, an abridgment of the Christian doctrine. As the sign of the authority of the Catholic Church, Papist writers cite the very act of changing the Sabbath into Sunday, which Protestants allow of, because by keeping Sunday, they acknowledge the church power. From the same page, the enforcement of Sunday keeping on the part of Protestant churches in enforcement of the worship of the beast. So once the people start enforcing a Sunday law, they're enforcing an enforcement of the worship of the beast. Therefore, it is Sunday keeping which is the mark of authority of the papacy or the beast of Revelation 13:5. And the speaking of the beast is the legislation of a Sunday law on a worldwide basis. So first it was a national Sunday law that started the 1335 days, but now it's a universal or worldwide basis legislation of a Sunday law to start now the 1260 days. So then we have here, definitely such a universal law is described as follows. Great Controversy, page 604. Fearful is the issue to which the world is to be brought. The powers of the earth, uniting to war against the commandments of God, will decree that all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bound, according to Revelation 13:16, shall conform to the customs of the church by the observance of the false Sabbath, Sunday. So therefore, we repeat again, the 1335 days timeline starts with a national Sunday law in the United States of America, where a universal Sunday law over the whole world will begin the 1260 days timeline. This is a major difference, but it follows one after the others. A review of the sequence of events. Number 1. A national Sunday law in the USA begins the end time scenario of the 1335 days. Number 2. This is the sign to leave the large cities preparatory for flight to the mountains. Number 3. A national Sunday law in the USA is followed shortly by national ruin. Number 4. A universal Sunday law over the whole world begins the 1260-day timeline. Number 5. The persecution or scattering of God's people begins as described below. Revelation 12:14. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, and that she might fly into the wilderness, into a place where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the face of the serpent. Number 6. The righteous experience the shaking and receiving of the seal of God. So this is an experience now that they're going to have to go through. Number 7, the righteous give the loud cry in the power of the latter rain. Number 8, the wicked receive the mark of the beast. With the issue thus clearly brought before him, whoever shall trample upon God's law to obey a human enactment receives the mark of the beast. He accepts the sign of allegiance to the power which he chooses to obey instead of God. The warning from heaven is, according to Revelation chapter 14, verses 9 and 10, if any man worship the beast and his image and receive his mark on his forehead or on his hand, in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. So the Sabbath will be the great test of loyalty. When the final test shall be brought to bear upon man, then the line of distinction will be drawn between those who serve God and those who serve him not. While one class, by accepting the sign of submission to earthly power, received the mark of the beast, the other, choosing the token of allegiance to divine authority, received the seal of God. Great Controversy, pages 604 and 605. Revelation 12, verse 14 has been applied by some to papal supremacy 538 to 1798. However, the primary application of verses 14 to 17 refers to the remnant, and this is the primary application of these verses, or the last generation against whom the dragon went to make war at the very end of time. So those who assume that Revelation 12:14 applied to the persecution of the past should remember that history will be repeated in regard to papal supremacy and persecution. The woman which takes flight into the wilderness in the future will refer not merely to Europe, like the first woman in Revelation 12, but to the most remote and desolate regions all over the world. The timelines of Daniel 12 deal with the most climatic events in the history of the world, by which the final destiny of man shall be decided. Part 11. What event ends the 1260-day timeline? The event which ends the 1260-day timeline is again fulfillment of prophecy as found in Revelation 13:15. It is the voice of speaking of the image of the beast and the nations. It is legislation of a decree. Revelation 13:15. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. The event which ends the 1260-day timeline is a universal death decree intended to exterminate all the people of God from the earth. Who are the characters in this drama who attempt to do this? They are, number one, the beast, which is the papacy in the old world, Roman Catholicism. Number two, the image to the beast, which is Protestantism in the New World, the United States of America. They both seek to accomplish the same goal, and that's why they are known as the beast and the image to the beast. One mirrors the others. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 15, it declares that it is the beast, Rome, backed by all nations, which will have the power to give life unto the image to the beast, the United States, that it should speak or legislate the universal death decree, that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. The United States then leads out in this, but the rest of the world follows, as expressed in the paragraph below. The manner in which this death decree is legislated is described. Great Controversy, pages 615 to 616. As the Sabbath has become the special point of controversy throughout Christendom, and religious and secular authorities have combined to enforce the observance of the Sunday, the persistent refusal of a small minority to yield to the popular demand will make them objects of universal execration. It will be urged that the few who stand in opposition to an institution of the Church and the law of the state ought not to be tolerated, that it is better for them to suffer than for whole nations to be thrown into confusion and lawlessness. The same argument 1800 years ago was brought against Christ by the rulers of the people. It is expedient for us, said the wily Caiaphas, that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should perish not. John 11:50. This argument will appear conclusive, and a decree will finally be issued against those who allow the Sabbath of the fourth commandment, denouncing them as deserving of a severest punishment, and giving the people liberty after a certain time to put them to death. Romanism in the Old World and apostate Protestantism in the New will pursue a similar course toward those who honor all the divine precepts. Although the United States of America speaks, it becomes a universal death decree in both the Old World and the New World all over the world. It becomes the voice of all nations which worship the beast, Revelation 13, verses 3, 7, 8, and 11. Do not confuse death penalties, which attend Sunday legislation, with the final universal death decree. Whereas death penalties occur before the 7 last plagues begin, the final universal death decree occurs under the 6th plague. This concept would be dealt with in detail in a chapter to come. This confusion between penalties and the final universal death decree has caused some to get end-time event completely out of order. They have attempted to place the final universal death decree before the 7 last plagues begin. This is error. As will be seen later, the last generation are delivered from the final universal death decree by the voice of God, which occurs under the 7 plagues of Revelation 16:17. The gathering of the kings of the earth to legislate a final death decree occurs under the 6th plague. The voice of God, deliverance from the final death decree, is the stroke of action which divide the 6 and the 7 plagues in this final crisis. Great Controversy, page 635. When the protection of human laws shall be withdrawn from those who honor the law of God, there will be in different lands a simultaneous movement for this destruction. At the time appointed, in the decree draws near, the people will conspire to root out the hated sect. It will be determined to strike in on one night a decisive blow, which shall literally silence the voice of dissent and reproof. Continuing with page 626 of the same book, as the decree issued by the various rulers of Christendom against commandment keepers shall withdraw the protection of government and abandon them to those who desire their destruction, the people of God will flee from the cities and villages and associate together in companies, dwelling in the most desolate and solitary places. Many will find refuge in the strongholds of the mountain. Like the Christians of the Piedmont Valley, they will make the high places of the earth their sanctuary and will thank God for the munitions of rocks. Isaiah 33, verse 16. But many of all nations and of all classes, high and low, rich and poor, black and white, will be cast into the most unjust and cruel bondage. The beloved of God pass weary days bound in chains, shut in prison bars, sentenced to be slain. Some apparently left to die of starvation in dark and loathsome dungeons. No human ear is open to hear their moans. No human hand is ready to lend them help. Let us keep in mind that the 1260-day timeline deals with the scattering or persecuting of God's people. It is the scattering which is the subject of the timeline. The scattering climaxes when the wicked determine to pass a final universal death decree to wipe them out. So here we have the Universal Sunday Law, which starts the 1260 days timeline and finishes with the Universal Death Decree. So here we have times and a half of scattering or persecuting of the holy people. Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. Part 12, what is the Universal Death Decree? The Universal Death Decree is so important that it is a major event spoken of in Revelation 13:15, and it is a marker in the 1260-day timeline of Daniel 12:7. It is vital not only to the climax of the drama down here on earth, but it is the pivot of action in the court of heaven for God's deliverance of his people. God never runs ahead of the action and interaction of the demonstration of the great controversy between Christ and Satan. Before any action is taken by God, first evil must be unmasked and reveal itself completely before the universe. This principle of interaction has been demonstrated again and again in the Old Testament. First, you have wicked Pharaoh put to death that wants to put to death the Hebrew babes. Then, God permitted the death of the Egyptian firstborn. Not until the Egyptian army vowed to destroy utterly the Hebrews did God permit them to be destroyed at the Red Sea. Not until wicked Haman instigated a universal death decree against the Jews did God permit the destruction of those who planned their death. And at the end of the great controversy, as demonstrated in the earth's history, not until the wicked have fully demonstrated their determination to rid the earth of God's people by speaking audibly and legally, by legislation, and by all nations uniting their voices in a universal death decree, will God move to deliver his saints. A study of the 7 heads of the great red dragon in Revelation 12 reveals how Satan has attempted 7 times to establish a universal kingdom. He attempts to do this in the universal death decree. Great Controversy, page 618. As Satan influenced Esau to march against Jacob, so he will stir up the wicked to destroy God's people in the time of trouble. If he could blot them from the earth, his triumph would be complete. Satan assumes that if he could just once get all the inhabitants of this planet to follow him without any voice of dissent, he could legally claim it before the universe. God has never permitted this to happen, and his people will come through the persecution triumphant, 144,000 in numbers. Isaiah 30, verse 29 and 30. He shall have a song as in the night when a holy solemnity is kept, and gladness of heart, as when one goeth with a pipe, a trumpet, or a flute, to come into the mountain of the Lord, to the mighty one of Israel. And the Lord shall cause his glorious voice to be heard. Those who understand the timelines of Daniel 12 will see the universal death decree as one more sign of their near deliverance. So now we need to analyze what is the 1 hour of Revelation chapter 17, verses 12 and 13. And the 10 horn which you saw are 10 king which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. Revelation 17, 12 and 13. How can this portion of prophecy, which also deals with end-time events, be understood? Great Controversy 341. In view of the testimony of inspiration, how dare men teach that the revelation is a mystery beyond the reach of human understanding? It is a mystery revealed, a book opened. The study of the revelation directs the mind to the prophecies of Daniel, and both present most important instruction given of God to man concerning events to take place at the close of this world history. Revelation chapter 17 cannot be understood until the timelines of Daniel 12 are open to study. The timelines of Daniel 12 will not be completely unfolded until combined with the study of Revelation 17. The event which Daniel saw in Daniel 12, 7 and 11 are exactly the same events which John saw when he wrote Revelation 17. They both describe the final events which occurred just before the coming of Jesus. Revelation 17 throws great light on the timelines of Daniel 12 as follows. Number 1, the first important concept, which should be recognized, is the fact that there is an interval of time between the legislation or enactment of a law and the date when it shall go into effect or effective date. There is an interval of time between the universal death decree and the date when it goes into effect. This is clearly stated as follows. Clearly, a decree will finally be issued against those who allow the Sabbath of the fourth commandment, denouncing them as deserving of the severest punishment and giving the people liberty after a certain time to put them to death. Great Controversy, pages 615, 616. Though a general decree has fixed the time when commandment keepers may be put to death, their enemies, in some cases, may anticipate the decree and before the time specified will endeavor to take their lives. Page 631 of the Great Controversy. Number 2, the second point of consideration is the fact that a law goes into effect at midnight. The universal death decree goes into effect at midnight at a time specified. The decree has affixed the time, and after a certain time, they are to be put to death. So the decree has fixed the time, and after that time, then the people can be put to death. Midnight is the hour. And the voice of God's deliverance, number 3, occurs at midnight. So it delivers them from the universal death decree, which goes into effect at midnight. And this is clearly stated in Great Controversy, page 635. As the time appointed in the decree draws near, it will be determined to strike in one night a decisive blow. It is at midnight that God manifests his power for the deliverance of his people, page 636. In the midst of the angry heavens is one clear space of indescribable glory, whence comes the voice of God like the sound of many waters, saying, "It is done." Continuing with number 4, the legislation of universal death decree is to take place at a certain time, the end of the 1260-day timeline, and the date when it goes into effect is at the time specified, a fixed time, a certain time. None of this is indefinite. 1 hour spoken of in Revelation 17:12 is not indefinite. 1 hour is specific unit of time, a fixed unit and a certain unit. Let no one assume that 1 hour is an indefinite or just a short space of time. Number 5, the 1 hour of Revelation 17:12 is a time when the kings of the earth are united in purpose with the beast, and it is a time when these have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast to enforce the universal death decree. This fact is further reinforced in the next verse, which declares that they are united for the purpose to make war with the Lamb in the person of his people, for they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Number 6, or the 6th point, this 1 hour of Revelation 17:12-14 describes the reign or triumph of the beast when he's able to get the kings of the earth to support his universal death decree. From the time that the decree is enacted or legislated until it is enforced is 1 hour of exaltation. But for God's people, it is described as the time of Jacob's trouble. Great Controversy, page 616. The people of God will then be plunged into those scenes of affliction and distress described by the prophet as the time of Jacob's trouble. Number 7, on a certain date at midnight, the universal death decree goes in effect. It will appear that 1 literal hour is too short an interval between legislation and enforcement. Therefore, the 1 hour of Revelation 17:12, which is written in the context of symbolism of a beast and horns, is also symbolic time, and it needs to be decoded. Part 14. What is the year-day computation principle of prophetic interpretation? So this is never to be forgotten. The year-day computation principle is a standard of conversion. It is, in a way, similar to a yardstick, which makes it possible to convert inches to feet or feet to yards or inches to yards and vice versa. The year-day computation principle makes it possible to convert prophetic time or symbolic time to literal time. It's like the rule of measurement, and this is essential when decoding prophetic time and in matching symbolic prophetic time prophecies to literal historical events or to prophecies which are written in literal language. It is self-evident that Daniel 12 deals with timelines written in literal language, but Revelation is couched in symbolism, and the time which is written such a context is also symbolic time. If Daniel and Revelation are to be studied together, then it is necessary to use the year-day computation principle of conversion to link the times of literal Daniel to the times specified in symbolic Revelation. In order to decode the 1 hour of Revelation 17:12, we shall need to get out the old yardstick, year-day computation principle, to see what 1 hour of prophetic time equals in literal time. And here we have 1 prophetic day equal 1 literal year. So therefore, 1/24, which is 24 hours a day, of a prophetic day, 1 hour, 1/24 of a literal year. 1/12 of a literal year is 30 days, so 1/24 of literal years is 15 days. Therefore, 1 hour of prophetic time in Revelation 17:12 is 15 literal days. We may therefore conclude that from the time that the universal death decree is enacted by legislation, it will be 15 days until the decree is to be enforced. These 15 days are very important to the total structure of the entire 3 timelines of Daniel 12. So basically, this is a basic equation where if a prophetic day equals 1 literal year, and we know there are 24 days in an hour, so you will get 1/24 of a literal year, and that will give you your 15 days. So therefore, the year-day computation principle is the special object of satanic attack. By discarding it, the futurists were able to remove the finger of accusation from papal Rome. By discarding it, they were able to place the whole book of Daniel in confusion and darkness where apostate Protestantism resides today. This year-day computation principle has been under attack even in Adventism in the past decades. It is still under attack, and there are some who protest it, use to give light to the Revelation 17:12 verse, declaring it better to remain in darkness than to use this profitable tool. Although there is no Spirit of Prophecy statement to declare that this rule has been removed, there are many who assume that it disappeared in 1844. For a full discussion of this problem, see page 14, What Prophetic Time Shall Be No Longer. We are now at part 15. What is the relationship between the 1335 and the 1260 days? So the relationship between the two timelines is illustrated below. Again, as was mentioned, these three timelines of Daniel 12 always start with the voice and finish with the voice. So we will look at it now more carefully. We can see that the timeline of the 1335 and 1260 days do not begin at the same time. And they do not end at the same time either. So 1335 days and the 1260 days. They do not begin at the same time. They do not end at the same time. The 1260-day timeline resides within the 1335 days. This is the part that's within this big part. Number 4, both timelines begin and end with voices or legislation or speaking of government. Both timeline begins and end with fulfilled prophecy from Revelation. The 1260 day is that of persecution. The scattering here is the persecution. So we're going to look at it carefully again. The Revelation 13:11 starts the timeline of 1335 days wait with the voice of the United States with a national Sunday law. The 1260 days, the scattering or the persecution of God's people. Revelation 13 verse 5 starts with the voice or many voices of all the world, United States. Now we have a universal Sunday law. So here we have a national Sunday law. Now we have a universal Sunday law. Here we have one voice. Now we have many voices. And it terminates with Revelation 13:15 with many voices of all the world with the universal death decree. While 1335, Revelation 16:17 finishes with the voice of God. So now we're going to look at the difference in time of what happens between those two. So here we have both timeline begin and end with fulfilled prophecy from Revelation. Number 6, the 1260 days is that of persecution, while the 1335 days is a wait for the voice of God. And we know that the legislation of the universal death decree begins a 1-hour interim to effective date. We have found out that that 1 hour is 15 days, literal. Number 10, the 15 literal days plus the 1260 days equal 1275. So here we have it, 1260 plus 15, 1275. So let's follow this carefully. The 1275 days subtracted from 1335 leaves a 60-day interval between the United States of America National Sunday Law and the Universal Sunday Law all over the world. So here is the mathematics, which are quite simple. 1260 plus the 15 days will give us 1275. 1275 minus 1335, this will give us 60 days right here, which is not indicated on this graphic. And we are told here that if there is not a 60-day interval, the student of prophecy would know that this computation is incorrect. But if there is a 60-day interval, you would gain confidence in the entire study of the three timeline and their relationship to each other. Question: what does the 1260 days of scattering end? Why does the 1260 days of scattering end at the universal death decree legislation rather than at the voice of God's deliverance of God's people? So the question is, why does the 1260 day terminating with the universal death decree instead of the voice of God? That's a very good question. And the answer is, in the 1260 timeline of Daniel 12 verse 7, E, the persecutor, is the subject of the sentence. E is the one who is providing the action. This action, the verb of the sentence, is that he shall have accomplished to scatter or persecute. The 1260 day is a measurement of time, which describes the persecutor and his ascending action of persecution to its very climax. So he goes as far as he can go. It is not a measurement of time in which God's people are under stress and distress. So the 1260 day is a measurement of time which describes the persecutor, and now he will go up with persecution. It's not necessarily the measurement of time in which God's people, it says, of that. It's having to do with the persecutor more than the people themselves. Part 16. What is the time of Jacob's trouble? From the legislation of a universal death decree to its effective date, one symbolic hour of Revelation 17:12, as we saw, or 15 literal days, God's people endure the time of Jacob's trouble. Early writing, pages 36 and 37. A decree went forth to slay the saints, which caused them to cry day and night for deliverance. This was the time of Jacob's trouble. Great controversy, 6:15, 6:16. A decree will finally be issued against those who allow the Sabbath of the fourth commandment, giving the people liberty after a certain time to put them to death. The people of God will then be plunged in those scenes of affliction and distress described by the prophet as the time of Jacob's trouble. From the same book, page 618, as Satan influenced Esau to march against Jacob, so he will stir up the wicked to destroy God's people in the time of trouble. And as he accused Jacob, he will urge his accusations against the people of God. He numbers the world as his subjects, but the little company who keep the commandments of God are resisting his supremacy. If he could blot them out from the earth, his triumph would be complete. Although Satan is seeking to blot them from the earth through legislation and the actions of the wicked, yet guardian angels have them fully protected. Great controversy, page 618. He sees, this is Satan, he sees that holy angels are guarding them. Page 631 of the same book, the heavenly sentinels, faithful to their trust, continue their watch. Though a general decree has fixed the time when commandment keepers may be put to death, their enemies will in some cases anticipate the decree, and before the time specified, will endeavor to take their lives. But none can pass the mighty guardian stationed about every faithful soul. Some are assailed in their flight from the cities and villages, but the sword raised against them break and fall as powerless as a straw. Others are defended by angels in the form of men of war. Page 619, the affliction and distress in the time of Jacob's trouble is caused by Satan as he tries them in mental anguish. There is no visible evidence that they will be delivered from the wicked, and they must live by faith in the word of God. They have no tangible evidence that God will deliver them, and they afflict their souls before God, pointing to their past repentance of their sins. Great controversy, page 62. But while they have a deep sense of their unworthiness, they have no concealed wrong to reveal. Their sins have gone beforehand to judgment, and they have been blotted out, and they cannot bring them to remembrance. This might be page 620. Now we have diagrams here of the time of Jacob's trouble. And again, it may be a repetition, but it's very important to know it. So the time of Jacob's trouble, which lasts for one symbolic hour of Revelation 17:12 or 15 literal days. So it begins with the universal death decree, Revelation 13:15, and it ends with the voice of God, Revelation 16:17. So here we are finished with the 1260 days, which terminated at the universal death decree, and now we're talking about the 15 days between the universal death decree and the voice of God of Revelation 16:17. So here is a list of events which begins and ends and occurred during the time of Jacob's trouble, as given in early writing and the Great Controversy. So rather than numbering them, we'll just simply read them at random, and we will also not mention the books where they will be drawn from, as you have it in front of you. A writing or a universal death decree begins the time of Jacob's trouble. The saints were calm and composed, trusting God. Satan desires to destroy them. The wicked rush in, but angel protects the saints. The saints cry day and night for deliverance from the wicked. The saints leave cities and villages. The wicked pursue, but the swords fall powerless as straw. The saints suffer mental anguish wrestling with God to help. At midnight, the saints are delivered. The voice of God speaks the day and hour of the coming of Jesus. The voice of God delivers them from the time of Jacob's trouble. Legislation of a universal death decree began the time of Jacob's trouble. As Esau marched against Jacob, the wicked surround the saints. Satan has an accurate knowledge of past sins of the saints. Satan presents their sins before God. The Lord permits Satan to try them to the uttermost. The saints see little good in their past lives. The saints are conscious of their weakness and unworthiness. Satan tells them their case are hopeless. The saints afflict their soul. Has every sin been repented of? The saints plead the righteousness of Christ. The saints desire wickedness to end. The saints' sin have been blotted out before end. The saints cannot remember now the sins which have been blotted out. The saints endure weariness, daily hunger. Satan personates Christ. This may not be the first time. The saints flee cities and villages. They associate together in companies. They retreat to the mountains, and some of the saints are imprisoned. The saints are defended against attack by angels as men of war. Finally, the saints are delivered from the time of Jacob's trouble by the voice of God. So here again, we have another graphic showing precisely the events that we have mentioned earlier of the two timelines we're talking about here, 1260 and 1335 days. The 1275 days is made up by the difference with the 15 days here, but we have a national Sunday law with the United States of America first, which draws us the voice of God at the end. A universal Sunday law, which basically for the 1260 days terminates with the universal death decree, but a universal Sunday law also starts a 1275 days timeline, which include between the universal death decree and the voice of God 15 days. So this is pretty clear, and let's not confuse them. National Sunday law, universal Sunday law, universal death decree, voice of God. And these are all attached to some scriptures of the Word of God, the book of Revelation. Part 17. What are these things that shall be finished in Daniel chapter 12, verse 7? It shall be for a time, times and a half, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So what are all these things which shall be finished at the end of the 1260 days of Daniel 12:7? The answer lies in an understanding of the objective of the great controversy between good and evil. This objective is to expose the complete malignity of sin. And this planet for nearly 6 millennia has been the demonstration arena of the great controversy between good and evil. Satan has claimed this world as a proving ground. The unfallen inhabitants of the universe as spectators have watched this great struggle. God's people have borne the brunt of this confrontation. From the time that Cain murdered Abel, the wicked have persecuted the holy people. Daniel 12:7 is simply a statement that he, the persecutor, shall have accomplished to scatter or reach the ultimate in persecutions by the legislation of a universal death decree by the end of the 1260 literal days timeline. The universal death decree, which ends the 1260 days, as we have seen, culminates and encompasses all persecutions of all the ages. At last, the wicked have devised a plan to utterly annihilate God's people from the earth. In this universal death decree, they will have gone to their limit. They have reached their limit, basically. They can go no further. By this decree, they will have also spoken or legislated their own condemnation in heaven's court. When all the world wanders after the beast of Revelation 13, and when all their kings are gathered together by evil spirits under the 6 plagues of Revelation 16:14 to legislate a universal death decree to rid the earth of the people of God, this action will be the culmination of all persecutions. All these things which the wicked have done against God's people will be finished. The universe will have seen enough. Satan and all his wicked hosts would have openly exposed their malignity in legal action. They would have sealed their doom. What it is true that the universal death decree is similar to Esau marching against Jacob, and that God's people will cry day and night for deliverance from their enemies, in that interim between legislation and effective date, known as the time of Jacob's trouble, yet they will be protected, and all these things in the display of persecution will be finished. All these things that shall be finished at the end of the 1260 days do not refer to the day and hour of the coming of Jesus. They do not refer to the voice of God's deliverance, nor the fall of Babylon described under the 7 plagues. They do not refer to the millennium, nor the destruction of sin and sinner and the lake of fire. They do not refer to the end of the distress and discomforts of God's people. All these things refer only to that which is brought to view in the verse itself of Daniel 12:7, when he shall scatter the power of the holy people, persecution, and the climax of all persecuting action of the wicked in the great controversy. Again, another graphic to explain it, or diagram. Here we have it. We start now again with the same, the end of the beginning and the end of the 1260 days of persecution with the universal Sunday law. So we remember 1335 starts with the United States National Sunday law, but the 1260 days of persecution starts with the universal Sunday law of all the nation, and their voices may be heard, and it will terminate with the universal death decree. All these things, persecution shall be finished. And then the universal death decree itself will last 15 days, which will be called the time of Jacob's trouble, but the people are protected, and we are under the 6th plague. And this is accomplished to the voice of God, that 15 days. The middle of it is the voice of God, 15 days. Another 15 days starts after that with the fall of Babylon under the 7 plagues. So this is the 6 plagues, and the other 15 days is the 7 plagues. Very, very important event, very well graphically presented, so we can memorize them, understand them, and specifically know when these things, when they come to pass, the Lord had told us in advance. That's why this book, this explanation of the book of warning is so important. And if you do not quite see it, study it. Study it many, many times. Here is the summary of chapter 4. What is the 1260-day timelines of Daniel chapter 12, verse 7? The 1260-day timeline of Daniel 12:7 reveals the following. Jesus, the man clothed in linen as high priest, places Daniel 12:7 in a time frame after 1844, within the Day of Atonement, and at the end of earth history. Jesus himself, the great high priest in the atonement, has taken an oath that the final scattering of the last generation shall not extend beyond 1260 literal days. Not many generations, but at least the last generation shall see all these things, persecuting action, attending the demonstration of the great controversy, which then will be finished. Papal Rome is he which will scatter or persecute the last generation for 1260 literal days in papal supremacy number 2. Papal supremacy number 2 will reign not merely over Europe, but over all kindreds and tongues and nations and people. This is not a futurist, but a true historicist identifies the end time Antichrist as papal Rome. The times and a half of Daniel 12:7 are literal days, 1260 days. The literal day timeline is consistent with the 1335-day timeline in that it begins and ends with voices. The Daniel 12 timelines and Revelation 13 are parallel prophetic scriptures. The voices are governments speaking in legislation. The event which begins the 1260-day timeline is a universal Sunday law. The event which ends the 1260-day timeline is a universal death decree. The universal death decree is the climax of all persecuting action. The universal death decree is the end of the 1260 days of scattering. God's people will be fully protected. There is a time interval between legislation of a decree and its effective date. There is a 15-day interval between the universal death decree and its effective date. And this is of enforcement spoken of as one symbolic hour in Revelation 17:12. The 15-day interim is a reign of the wicked in exaltation. The 15-day interim is a time of Jacob's trouble for the saints. The year-day computation principle is still valid, and by it, the 1 hour of Revelation 17:12 may be converted to 15 days of literal time. There is a relationship between the 1260 and the 1335-day timelines of Daniel 12. They neither begin nor end at the same time, but are interlocking in their delineation of sequential events. After the passing of the universal death decree, God's people are protected from the wicked. The demonstration of the malignity of sin ends at the universal death decree. The 1260-day timeline does not end the discomfort or distress of God's holy people. Daniel 12:7 focus on the wicked when he shall have accomplished to scatter or reach the climax of his scattering action and legislation of a universal death decree, when all these things, persecuting action, shall be finished. The righteous wait 1335 days for the voice of God's deliverance. The righteous wait 15 days from the universal death decree to the voice of God. The delineation of events does not predict the day and the hour of Jesus' coming. It does give hope and joy to the last generation that they can survive the final crisis. The timeline are not given as an exercise in counting, but to give firm support to God's people. And this now finishes the chapter 4 of the book of Daniel, the 1260 days timeline. And in the next step, we will be studying now the chapter 5, which involves with the daily. May the Lord bless you and cause his face to shine upon you and give you peace.